learned speakers of the eminence of Dr. Anjani Jain and Mr. Sonal Dabral. The session will be chaired by Mr. S.K. Mishra, CGM SBI, who is the partner of the event. To begin the proceedings of the session, may I request Mr. Saurabh Singh Mehta, Kriti Industries, to come on the stage, please. Thank you.
Very good afternoon to all the delegates and the wonderful audience present here. I welcome you all to the first business session of the 20th IMA International Management Conclave 2011. Today, the biggest challenges that we have is to steer our organizations and harness emerging opportunities and prepare ourselves to face unpredictable times. All the more, in a place like Indore, we need to learn from successful leaders and this is why we have chosen the theme of the conclave as Hope to Triumph, Leading in Turbulent Times. I am sure the participants will immensely benefit by the deliberations. On behalf of IMA, I would like to request the session chairman, Mr. S.K. Mishra, who is the Chief General Manager of State Bank of India, to kindly escort our speakers, Dr. Anjani Jain and Mr. Sonal Dabral, to the dais. I would like to extend a warm welcome to the honorable speakers. Can we have the AV, please?
Year 1806 was a significant year in the history of banking in India. It was this year that the journey of State Bank of India began with the Bank of Calcutta, the first modern bank to be set up in the Indian subcontinent for European businesses. This bank was followed by the Bank of Bombay in 1840 and the Bank of Madras in 1843 for the other two presidencies. In 1921, the three presidency banks were merged to become the Imperial Bank of India. On 1st July 1955, under a special act, the State Bank of India Act, the Imperial Bank of India became the State Bank of India. What used to be a purely commercial enterprise rededicated itself to being a national bank. On 1st October 1959, with the passing of the Subsidiary Banks Act, State Bank of Hyderabad became the first subsidiary of SBI. followed by the takeover of major state-associated banks as its subsidiaries. As India embraced the Industrial Revolution of the 60s, SBI played a major role in financing industrial expansion of key sectors like iron and steel, manufacturing, power, ports, and so on. In the early 70s, the bank catalyzed the ongoing grain revolution. In the early 90s, the bank became the first public sector bank to access the domestic and international capital markets. By the year 2008, one of the world's largest co-banking solutions had been successfully implemented, linking up even far-flung places. The bank used technology as a great enabler in empowering customers to bank from anywhere, anytime. The bank was always for the development of industries as a major driver of progress and employment generation. SBI today operates 13,542 branches across the nation. The bank also has the largest ATM network of 25,005 group ATMs. Currently, SBI is the single largest retail lender in India, providing affordable credit to the common man. State Bank of India has always been conscious of its responsibilities to the society. Under the banner of community service banking, the bank regularly touches various economic, environmental, and welfare activities, focusing on social upliftment. In yet another pioneering move, SBI adopted the green banking policy to reduce carbon footprints by adopting low carbon emission practices. Inheritors of a glorious past, living in a purposeful present, the State Bank of India continues fostering the hopes and dreams of millions of its citizens, rededicating itself to the service of the nation. As the banker to every Indian.
Now I would request Ms. Niharika Sharma to extend a floral welcome to Dr. Anjani Jain. Mr. Alok Jain to offer a floral welcome to Mr. Mishra. And Professor Kapil Suri to offer a floral welcome to Mr. Sonal Dabral. Please play the audiovisual introduction of our distinguished speaker, Dr. Anjani Jain.
Dr. Anjani Jain, the son of the soil who made it big amongst the biggies, the current dean of Wharton's MBA program for executives. Dr. Anjani stepped into the world of academics from Indore University. Yes, from this very city. An alumni of IIM Ahmedabad, he earned his doctoral decoration from the University of California, Los Angeles. and went on to become the director of the MBA program at Wharton. A teacher and a consultant of highly credible international repute, especially in the automotive and private equity space. Dr. Anjani's teaching, researching and consulting expertise lie in subjects that are not only difficult to pronounce, but even more difficult to understand. Optimization algorithms and probabilistic analysis of combinatorial problems and the such. Please extend a warm welcome to this unassuming man who deals in the most difficult of difficulties, Dr. Anjani Jain.
I would now like to invite Dr. Anjani Jain. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Anjani Jain.
Distinguished guests and dear students, आपके आमंत्रण का मैं बहुत आभारी हूँ। मैं इंदौर का ही भूमि पुत्र हूँ, जैसे आपने सुना, और हिंदी मेरी मातृभाषा है, लेकिन इंदौर से निकले हुए करीब 35 साल हो गए, तो हिंदी में सुविधा कुछ कम हो गई है, तो मैं आपको कुछ जो थोड़ी बातें बोलना चाहता हूँ अब अंग्रेजी में ही करूँगा. So I'm indeed very honored to be at this gathering of some of the most luminary leaders of Indian business and government. It's truly inspiring to be here and immensely gratifying to see what all of you have done to transform this city, which in my time here was a bit sleepy. I sometimes described it to my American friends as the Midwest of India. And it's absolutely energizing to be here after a long hiatus. So I'll draw upon my experience as an educator, and I'll offer some reflections on the opportunities and challenges facing India's higher education system. And though my comments are somewhat orthogonal to the theme of this conference, I'll make the claim that as leaders in your respective domains, all of you have a stake in improving education at all levels in the country. I'm deeply honored to be sharing this podium with Mr. N.R. Narayan Murthy, whose lifetime of extraordinary achievement we are all here to celebrate, and of the many strokes of good fortune that have shaped the arc of my life. Perhaps none was more significant than meeting Murthy and Sudha at a young age, about 33 years ago in Pune. Murthy was beginning to lay the foundation of Infosys while working at Botany Computer Systems, a company that has connections to the city of Indore. Sudha was a bright young engineer who worked at Telco while supporting Murthy's nascent quest. Not all of you might know this, but as the topper of her class at IISc Bangalore, Sudha had a full scholarship for a PhD in electrical engineering at MIT, but chose to stay in India and support Murthy. I had recently graduated from IIM Ahmedabad and had joined a think tank in Pune, started by Professor J.G. Krishnaiah, who had left IIM Ahmedabad and gathered around him an extraordinary group of young people dedicated to the proposition that one could apply management principles to improve public sector and government organizations in India, which in that era occupied the commanding heights of the economy, as it was called. As a whiz kid computer scientist, whom we held in awe, Murthy was one of the first staff members of Systems Research Institute, or SRI as the think tank was called, and was brought along by Professor Krishnaiah from IIM Ahmedabad. So, stories of Murthy's life, some beautifully chronicled by Sudha in her books, of his principled and purposeful quest that led to the creation of Infosys, are now legend. But there is one story that I suspect you don't know because it came to me from Murthy himself quite by chance about 12 years ago when we were reminiscing about our days in Pune and SRI. 2 years later, Murthy was the chief guest at Wharton's graduation ceremony, and in my speech as Vice Dean, I took the liberty of narrating this story to Wharton's graduating class, and I'm taking the liberty of repeating it here. I told my students that when I finished my MBA and joined SRI, I was possessed of a certain self-conscious idealism and was conspicuously proud of having taken up a job that drew the lowest starting salary among my classmates, 1,000 rupees a month. In case you're wondering, this was no hardship wage. I suspect my income was still comfortably in the top decile of India's income distribution. What I did not know at the time, what nobody knew, and what I did not find out until that chance conversation 12 years ago, was that Murthy, who earned no more than I did, had privately gone back to Professor Krishnaiah a couple of months after joining SRI and had told him that he only needed half the salary that he was being paid. Even if this idea had miraculously appeared to me, I wouldn't have tested my idealism that much. So I told our students that I was not going to ask them to go back to their employers and offer half their salaries back. But there was a message in the story about the courage of convictions and about humility and selflessness. I told them the Hindi proverb, Neki kar, darya mein dal. Do good deeds, then throw them in the river. An act of generosity requires no proclamation. It carries its own intrinsic reward. I have been an educator most of my life, but that is not what I aspired to growing up right here. Born and educated largely in Indore, my own trajectory of life has been shaped as much by good fortune and serendipity as by a planned pursuit. I was fortunate to be born in a family that valued education and hard work. As displaced persons who lost most of their possessions, material possessions in West Punjab, when partition came, my grandparents started life from scratch in a new land. They were keenly aware that their most valuable possession was their education. My paternal grandfather, who as a doctor could carry his profession with him, found Indore to be an inviting combination of temperate climate and gentle society and made the city his home. He eventually became well known as one of Indore's best physicians and a great humanitarian. My father, who is in the audience along with my mother, my brother and his wife, and my uncle, who I'll mention in a moment. So my father and his siblings all became successful in their chosen endeavors and remained untainted by worldly success. My father served with dignity, dedication, and uncompromising integrity in the Indian Police Service, even as he saw a culture of corruption hold sway all around him. He retired as a DGP and then was called upon to serve as a vice chancellor of 2 different universities. My mother devoted her life to raising us with gentle love and nurturing care that taught us right from wrong and gave us the freedom and confidence to venture beyond our boundaries. My father's older brother, Dr. Jain, who is here, is one of the finest mathematicians that I have known, who dedicated his life to doing world-class mathematical research in a system that neither expected nor rewarded it. He was also an inspirational and exacting teacher, as I learned from first-hand experience in his courses at Holkar College. I shared this autobiographical note, perhaps overtaxing your indulgence, only to say that I look back to my antecedents in the city with a great deal of fondness and gratitude. My years of schooling at Bal Vinay Mandir, an astonishingly progressive school founded by the great educator Mrs. Padmanabhan, and my subsequent sojourns at Kendriya Vidyalaya and Holkar Science College gave me access to some gifted and dedicated teachers who helped lay the foundation for what became, somewhat improbably, my own career as an educator. But I don't want to sugarcoat or over-sentimentalize. I also saw vast oceans of mediocrity, indifference, and ineptitude in our educational institutions, which made the islands of excellence seem even more remarkable. If it were not for the fluke by which I got into IMA Ahmedabad, the only kid in the class from the entire state of undivided Madhya Pradesh, and before that my brother had been the only kid to get into IIT from his cohort from the entire state. So if it were not for the fluke accident in my case, I suspect that my opportunities in life would have been considerably truncated. I saw many bright kids of my generation being underserved by the educational system. And now, as Mr. Murthy said, as the nation stands on the cusp of sustained and substantial economic growth, with a collective sense that he talked about of optimism and self-confidence, not seen in our society for the last 300 to 350 years, I see education as a critical determinant of India's future. How well we seize the opportunity created by India's momentum of the last 2 decades, reap the demographic dividend created by that we have inherited, and keep the new tryst with destiny that the generation of Narayan Murthy has offered us will greatly depend on how well we educate our young people. This is the simple lesson of history, from the European Renaissance to the ascendance of America in the last century, and now to China's spectacular growth. We now have almost all the ingredients that make nations and societies vibrant. Perhaps the most important among them is the freedom we enjoy to disagree, to doubt and dissent, a tolerance of differences, and a healthy profusion of cultural diversity. When these attributes of our society are underpinned by widespread education and economic opportunity, they create a fertile ground for creativity and innovation. From my distant vantage point, I see many reasons for optimism looking ahead, but also some challenges. Let me mention one of the truly remarkable traditions that elite Indian universities and branches of civil service have developed in their post-independence history. It is the tradition of an almost absurdly pure meritocracy whose existence in a society still rife with corruption and graft is all the more surprising. As you know, a necessary condition for admission to these institutions is a high score on entrance examination, a system that appears quaint and narrowly unidimensional when viewed from an American perspective. Indeed, one may question whether the ability to solve contrived mathematical puzzles rapidly, for instance, on the common admission test for the IIMs, predicts the candidate's ability to manage large corporations, create new enterprises, or be an effective leader. But despite its reliance on a narrow assessment of skills, the system does have 2 compelling virtues, perhaps both unintended, that I suspect are not fully appreciated. The first virtue is that the system's reliance on quantifiable, objective, and anonymous measurement is precisely what makes it impervious, impenetrable to any influences of money or politics. This imperviousness is astonishing in the Indian context. Imagine that these processes included subjective assessments of personal qualities such as leadership, interpersonal skill, creativity, etc., that American universities use for nearly all their academic programs. My hunch is that if you open the door in India even slightly to these subjective assessments, you run the risk of caving in to undue influences. Yes, selection processes at elite universities and civil services do use interviews and other subjective assessments, but the first screen, the necessary but insufficient condition for entry, is essentially completely quantitative. I think this is a robust design. The second virtue is this. While the entrance test patently doesn't measure leadership, entrepreneurial, or creative abilities, our elite universities have produced more than their share of leaders in a wide range of human endeavors. A plausible explanation of the success rate is that while the ability to solve contrived mathematical puzzles does not directly translate to visionary leadership, there is a common underlying personality trait that helps one succeed both in these entrance tests and in the larger domains of leadership. That trait is hard work, determination, and the will to overcome difficult odds or competition. So the narrow mathematical tests indirectly and inadvertently also end up measuring willpower and determination, which probably matter much more than mathematical ability. Moreover, being admitted to these institutions creates a powerful affirmation of talent, and society begins to open its doors of opportunity in expectation of that talent. Regardless of whether I'm right about the virtues I have claimed, I suspect there is more agreement about the immeasurably powerful democratizing influence of these institutions in a society still riddled with inequities based on caste, religion, and economic class differences. Our elite university educational institutions in India have created enormous social mobility and opportunity for underprivileged kids. And though parental wealth can help a student prepare for these tests, ultimately raw talent does prevail. I admit that there are downsides to the system as well, especially in the emotional toll that it takes on kids who try hard but don't succeed. Test preparation can also become so ritualized that it supplants real education. These problems undoubtedly exist, but they are best addressed by creating more high-quality institutions and not by altering the admissions processes. So the implication is this, at least for me. In India, for perfectly understandable reasons, we nurture, as a nation, a healthy desire to make our elite institutions more inclusive and accessible to groups that have been traditionally underprivileged and underrepresented. I worry, however, that our well-intentioned efforts to engineer the admissions processes in pursuit of inclusiveness can erode the very foundations of the meritocracy that we have so assiduously created, thus weakening the empowerment that underprivileged students have actually earned by demonstrating that they can compete without assistance and win. In my exposure to universities around the world, I have found this kind of meritocracy to be very rare indeed, and I include the United States in that category, and I think it is very much worth preserving. Our best educational institutions attract tremendously bright students and give them a rigorous education. Their faculty are equally brilliant and well-trained. But what we lack, both in our formal incentive structures and the informal culture of these institutions, is an emphasis on research and new knowledge creation. Though there are gifted scholars throughout the land, our PhD programs in most disciplines tend to languish. In this regard, the American universities stand in sharp contrast. The paradigm of research-based scholarship, originally imported from Germany, was adopted by virtually all top American universities in the early decades of the 20th century, and is now pervasive among hundreds of American universities. And it is an extraordinary culture that has served as a magnet for bright students around the world. This culture is the result not just of incentives and reward structures, but of the excitement and intrinsic joy that comes from discovering new knowledge. As a professor, you may have hundreds of papers to your credit and fancy titles and honors, but in your own mind, you're only as good as the last new idea you created. Even professional schools, with one foot firmly planted in the world of practice, emphasize scholarly research. Indeed, at business schools like Wharton, there is a refusal to accept the superficial dichotomies that sometimes characterize academia: research versus teaching or theory versus practice. Business problems require practical solutions, yet they are often beset with ever-changing complexities that defy common sense and require the most rigorous application of thought and analysis. The faculty's research, therefore, reflects the inseparable confluence of intellectual exuberance and pragmatic wisdom that faculty bring to bear on these emerging business problems. The curriculum reflects the breadth and depth of the faculty's knowledge and makes no apologies for its intellectual rigor. And teaching is guided by the belief that even good teachers, in the absence of sustained research, can eventually turn into bad teachers. This is the culture that universities in China and other emerging parts of the world are trying very hard to create, in many instances very successfully. Universities in India, despite their very high concentration of bright students, will not be world-class until they embrace knowledge creation as a core mission. But a university's mission goes beyond knowledge creation. In a wonderful book called The Idea of the University, published 160 years ago, Cardinal John Henry Newman said that a university should engage its students in the pursuit of an ascending hierarchy of 4 goals: information, knowledge, wisdom, and faith. If information is the answer to the question what, and knowledge the response to how, then wisdom may be said to be an understanding of why. But wisdom is perhaps more elusive and not always accessible to its seekers. Perhaps that is what Oscar Wilde meant when he said, "Education in itself is an admirable thing, but nothing worth knowing can be taught." I tend to be more optimistic than Oscar Wilde, for I believe that a university can create an environment that is conducive to the pursuit of wisdom. Faith, the ultimate goal for Cardinal Newman, held a deeply spiritual meaning for a former agnostic who converted to Catholicism. And in the modern secular university, I tend to think of it in terms of ethics, morality, and the dignity of the fellow human being. Mr. Murthy spoke very eloquently about those themes this morning. These goals ought to remain at the forefront of a university's mission as well. It is reasonable to speculate, and I'll close with this thought, it is reasonable to speculate that one's moral character, to the extent it is not already inherited as a genetic trait, is shaped in early childhood at our parents' knees. Thus shaped, character guides our instincts and choices when we face ambiguities or ethical dilemmas. Character gives courage, or fails to, when we face ambiguities or ethical dilemmas. This intrinsic or early development view of moral character seems quite plausible, even axiomatic. But what seems to me equally plausible, but generally underestimated, is the converse possibility. That is, our actions and choices over time shape and reshape our moral character. The extent to which we bring ourselves in small, inconsequential matters to speak truth to power, question orthodoxies of belief, especially our own, and stand for principle over self-interest or expediency, we train our instincts and develop over time patterns of thought and responses that become second nature. This was my main point in recounting the story about Murthy. In itself, his voluntary cut in salary 3 decades ago was perhaps inconsequential, but it and a myriad of other such principled choices helped shape the person he is today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. Can we please play the audiovisual introduction of our next speaker, Mr. Sonal Dabral?